For years, I dreamed of giving my parents something that would finally make them proud of me. Not words, not empty achievements they never seemed to value, but something real, something they could see and touch. So I worked. Days blurred into nights, weeks into months. I waited tables, took online jobs, and even freelanced at night just to save enough. Every time my body ached and I thought about quitting, I reminded myself of their faces, of how happy they'd look standing in front of their own home. When I finally signed the papers, the moment felt unreal. I wasn't just buying walls and a roof. I was buying a piece of peace for us. The house was small but beautiful, with a garden and tall windows that caught the morning light. I had it furnished, stocked the kitchen, even hung the curtains myself. Everything was perfect by the time I handed my parents the keys. My mom started crying the moment she stepped inside. She touched the walls like they were made of gold. My dad said nothing for a while, just stood there, staring at the living room like he couldn't believe it was real. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You did this for us?" I nodded and he hugged me, something he hadn't done in years. That hug felt like a reward for all the nights I'd spent working until sunrise. I didn't care that I had taken a mortgage under my name. I didn't care that I had emptied my savings. I just wanted them to be happy, and they were. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Mom would send me photos of flowers she planted in the backyard. Dad bragged to neighbors that his girl bought them a home. It was the first time in my life I felt like I belonged in their pride. But it didn't take long before little things began to change. They started talking more about my brother, Ethan, the one who never stayed in one job, who always needed one more chance. He moved in temporarily, Mom said, just until he got back on his feet. I told her it was fine, but something in my chest tightened. I brushed it off. Family helps each other, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down I could already feel the shift. The warmth I'd bought with that house was beginning to cool. Their smiles were still there, but they weren't for me anymore. And though I didn't know it then, that house, my gift of love, would soon become the weapon they used against me. Started with small things. Ethan would borrow money from my parents, or rather from me, because everything they had came from the money I sent every month. Mom always defended him, saying he was trying his best. Dad, who once called him lazy, began to laugh at his jokes again. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that this is what families do: they forgive, they help, they stay together. Then Ethan's boxes began to fill the hallway. "Just until I find my own place," he said, smiling like it was already his home. Soon, his clothes hung in the master bedroom closet. His gaming setup took over the living room, and his car was parked in the garage I had paid for. Mom said I was overreacting when I asked how long he was staying. "He's your brother, Adriana. Don't be selfish." Selfish. That word stung. I had worked for years so they could live without worry. I never asked for anything in return. But the more time passed, the more invisible I became. My visits grew shorter, their calls less frequent. When I came over, Ethan was always there, sitting in my father's chair, eating my mother's cooking, talking about new business ideas that never existed. And they listened. They admired him for his confidence, his charm. One afternoon, I came by with groceries and noticed a new flat-screen TV in the living room. "Ethan got it for us," Mom said proudly. The price tag was still on the side, the same store where I had an account. My stomach sank. They were using my credit card again. I wanted to confront them, but I couldn't find the right words. Every time I opened my mouth, I saw their faces. Tired, smiling, grateful. The same faces I once wanted to protect. So I said nothing. Weeks passed, and I tried to distract myself with work. But one evening, I saw a picture on social media that froze my blood. My parents, my brother, and a few family friends were at a barbecue in my backyard. Everyone was laughing. My chair, my table, my house. And not a single message from them inviting me. For the first time, I didn't feel like their daughter. I felt like a stranger who had bought her way out of their hearts. That night, I stared at the house contract on my desk. My name was there, on the loan, on the payments, on the documents. Everything legal and binding belonged to me. But I realized something terrible. The love I'd been paying for all these years was never mine to own. It was a quiet morning when the phone rang. I was halfway through my coffee, already thinking about work, when the voice on the other end said something that made my heart drop. "Miss Rivera." "We're calling from Crescent Bank regarding your mortgage payment. It's overdue by 2 months." For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. I never missed a payment. I opened my banking app, scrolled through the history. Every transfer was on time. "There must be an error," I said calmly, but my hands were shaking. "The house belongs to my parents. They live there now." The woman hesitated. "According to our records, the property ownership was transferred 6 weeks ago. But the loan remains under your name." I froze. "Transferred? How? I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't even seen my parents in nearly a month." After the call ended, I couldn't breathe properly. My heart pounded in my ears as I pulled up the property records online. And there it was, my house, the one I had bought and paid for, now listed under Ethan Rivera, my brother. The documents were right there on the screen, signed and sealed. My signature looked perfect, the same curve, the same angle, but it wasn't mine. I felt sick. Betrayal has a sound. It's the quiet click of a mouse when you realize your own family stole from you. I drove to my parents' house that evening, rain hitting the windshield like stones. The lights were on, laughter spilled through the open windows. They were having dinner, as if nothing had happened. When my mother opened the door, she looked surprised, almost guilty. My father barely glanced up from his plate. Ethan smiled like a man who had already won. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply asked one question. "Who signed my name?" No one answered. My father cleared his throat and muttered something about what's best for the family. Mom whispered that Ethan needed stability. That word again, needed. He always needed, and I always gave. I realized then that I had built a home not for my parents but for a lie. A lie that now wore my last name, slept in my room, and called my debt his blessing. When I left that night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I only took one last look at the house through the car window. The porch light flickered, the same one I'd installed myself, and I finally understood something cruel. Sometimes the people you build a home for will burn it down just to keep themselves warm. A week later, I returned to the house. I told myself I just wanted to talk, to understand. But deep down, I already knew the truth. They didn't see it as betrayal. They thought they were right. When I walked in, the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. The table was set for 3. My plate wasn't there. Ethan sat at the head of the table, my father's place, laughing at something my mother had said. My father smiled, eyes warm, the same way he used to look at me when I was little. No one noticed me at first. Then my mother looked up, startled, almost as if she'd seen a ghost. "Oh, Adriana," she said softly. "We didn't know you were coming." I nodded, keeping my voice calm. I needed to ask something. The laughter stopped. The sound of the knife against the plate, the ticking of the wall clock. Everything suddenly felt too loud. I stood there, watching the family scene that used to be mine, and said, "Who transferred the house to Ethan's name?" No one spoke. My father took a slow sip of wine, pretending not to hear. My mother lowered her eyes. Ethan just smirked, leaning back in his chair like a king on his throne. Finally, my father said, "We did what's best for everyone. You don't need that house, you have your own life, your work. Ethan will start a family soon." It made sense. The word slid into me like a knife. What's best for everyone? Everyone but me. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make them understand what they had done. But instead I said only one sentence. "If it's his house now, then he can pay for it." My mother gasped softly, her voice trembling. "Adriana, don't be cruel. You know he can't." But I was already turning to leave. Outside, the air was heavy with rain. The windows glowed behind me, warm and golden, like a life I no longer belonged to. I stood by my car for a moment, listening to the faint sound of their laughter resuming, quieter this time, uneasy. It was in that moment that something inside me shifted. The part of me that always forgave, always gave, always hoped, it broke quietly without a sound. I had built that home with love. And that night, I left it behind with nothing but silence and the echo of my own footsteps. The first steps toward the truth I was finally ready to face. 2 weeks passed before I heard from any of them. The silence was louder than any words they could have said. I went to work, came home, tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, their laughter, their comfort inside a house I had built. I told myself I was done with them, that they'd made their choice, and now I would make mine. Then one evening the phone rang. The number flashed across the screen, Ethan. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity or maybe habit made me pick up. His voice was panicked. Adriana, the bank's calling me non-stop. They say the house is going into foreclosure. What the hell did you do? I sat in silence for a second, letting his words hang in the air. Then I said slowly, what I did? I stopped paying for something that isn't mine. He started shouting, his words messy and desperate. I could hear Mom in the background crying, begging him to calm down. Then the line went dead. For a moment I just sat there staring at the phone. The weight of years of sacrifice, guilt, love lifted piece by piece. For the first time it wasn't my problem anymore. A few days later Mom called. Her voice was smaller this time, not commanding, not angry, just tired. Adriana, please, they're threatening to take the house. Your brother can't fix this alone. You know we'll have nowhere to go. I listened quietly. Every word hurt, but differently now, not like a wound but like an old scar being touched. I had given them everything once. My money, my trust, my loyalty. And they had signed it away. So I took a deep breath and said softly, you already made your choice, Mom. This isn't mine to save anymore. There was silence. Then the faint sound of her sobbing before the call ended. That night I sat by the window, the city lights blinking like distant stars. For years I had thought love meant sacrifice. That to be a good daughter was to give, even when it hurt. But love isn't slavery. And family isn't ownership. Somewhere deep inside, I felt something unfamiliar, peace. Cold, steady peace. I didn't know what would happen next. If they would lose the house, if they would ever speak to me again. But I knew one thing for sure. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding the weight. They were. The courtroom smelled like paper and fear. I had never been in one before, and yet it felt strangely familiar. A place where words mattered more than blood. I sat quietly, my palms cold, my heart steady. Across the aisle, my parents and Ethan whispered among themselves. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father looked smaller somehow, like the weight of his choices had finally settled on his shoulders. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The lawyer I'd hired stood, calm and professional, explaining what had happened. How the property was transferred using forged documents, how my signature had been copied, how the loan still belonged to me. The evidence was clear. The handwriting expert confirmed what I already knew. The signature wasn't mine. Ethan tried to speak, saying it was a misunderstanding, that our parents thought I agreed. But the moment the judge asked if I had ever signed consent forms, he fell quiet. The truth had nowhere left to hide. I watched my parents closely. My mother's eyes glistened, not with remorse but with shame. My father's hands trembled as the verdict was read. The property transfer was declared invalid, ownership restored to me, and the guilty party fined for fraud. I should have felt victory, but all I felt was exhaustion. Years of love, loyalty, and trust had been turned into exhibits in a courtroom. I didn't look at them when it ended. I just gathered my papers and walked out. Outside, the sky was overcast, a pale gray that smelled like rain. The world looked the same, yet nothing in me was. For the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone anything. Not money, not forgiveness, not understanding. That evening I stood outside the house, my house, one last time. The garden was overgrown, the porch light flickered weakly, and the paint on the fence had started to peel. It no longer felt like home, only like a memory of one. I sold it a month later. The profit wasn't much, but it was enough to start over, far away from the ghosts of what used to be family. And though the world called it justice, I knew better. Justice isn't always triumph. Sometimes it's just peace, the quiet after years of noise, the stillness that finally lets you breathe. It took time for the silence to feel like peace. At first, every quiet morning felt like a reminder of what I'd lost, of who I used to be. I'd wake up expecting a message from Mom, or the sound of laughter from the old house. But there was nothing. Just sunlight on my new kitchen walls and the hum of the city outside. I moved into a small cottage on the edge of town. Not fancy, not large, but mine. Every piece of furniture, every nail in the wall was placed by my own hands. There were no family photos, no signs of the past, only fresh air and space to breathe. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if they missed me. If my mother still kept my number saved under my girl, or if my father ever thought about what he'd done. Maybe they did. Maybe not. But I had stopped waiting for answers. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The air smelled like rain and wildflowers. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger or sadness, only a quiet strength. I had been the daughter who gave, the sister who forgave, the woman who carried everyone else's weight. But not anymore. I thought about the house I'd built, how it had begun as a gift of love and turned into a lesson in betrayal. I realized now that it had taught me something more valuable than any apology ever could. That peace isn't found in keeping others happy, but in finally choosing yourself. As the sky darkened, I smiled small, real, free. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And this time no one could take it away.